Welcome back to the Mayor File. I'm your host. Today, we are opening a file that sits at the very top of the American power structure. It is a file that most of Washington has been afraid to touch for 30 years. It concerns the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. For generations, we have been told a story about this institution. We are told that it is a temple of law, a place where 9 wise men and women sit in robes, detached from the dirty business of politics, deciding cases based solely on the Constitution. They are supposed to be like umpires, calling balls and strikes, blind to the players on the field. But what if that story is a lie? What if one of the most powerful justices on the court isn't just an umpire, but a player on a team that is actively trying to rewrite the rules of the game? And what if the person coaching that team, the person raising the money, the person texting the White House chief of staff to overturn a presidential election, is the justice's own wife? Today we are analyzing Jane Mayer's explosive reporting on Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife, Virginia Ginni Thomas. This isn't just a story about a husband and wife with different hobbies. This is a story about a merger. A merger between the supreme judicial power of the United States and the most radical, well-funded activist wing of the far-right movement. Through Mayer's reporting in The New Yorker, specifically her groundbreaking investigations, like Is Ginni Thomas a Threat to the Supreme Court? And her decades of work on the Dark Money Network, we are going to expose a conflict of interest so deep, so blatant, and so potentially dangerous that it threatens the legitimacy of the entire American legal system. We are going to look at the texts, the money, the secret consultancy fees, and the Lone Dissent that Justice Thomas cast to protect the very insurrection his wife was cheering on. This is rigged justice. To understand the gravity of what Jane Mayer found, you have to understand who Ginni Thomas actually is. For years, the mainstream media treated her as a quirk. She was the conservative activist wife, a colorful character who occasionally made headlines for saying something controversial. But Mayer's reporting stripped away that harmless image. She revealed that Ginni Thomas is not just a spouse. She is a high-level political operative. She has been a lobbyist. She has been a consultant. She has been a leader in the Council for National Policy, a secretive networking group for the most powerful conservative donors and activists in the country. Mayer documents how Ginni Thomas positioned herself as the tip of the spear for the Trump movement inside the Beltway. But unlike other activists, she had a superpower that no one else had. She had the private ear of a Supreme Court justice. The crisis, and it is a crisis, came to a head in the chaotic weeks after the 2020 election. This is where Mayer's reporting becomes absolutely essential to history. While the country was watching the vote counts, Ginni Thomas was busy. She wasn't just posting on Facebook. She was texting the White House chief of staff, Mark Meadows. In a series of texts that Mayer and other investigative journalists later analyzed, Ginni Thomas sounded less like a lawyer's wife and more like a QAnon believer. She told Meadows to release the Kraken. She called the Biden election victory the greatest heist of our history. She implored the chief of staff of the President of the United States to fight to the bitter end to overturn the will of the voters. These weren't casual texts. This was the spouse of a sitting Supreme Court justice advising the White House on a legal strategy to subvert the Constitution. Now pause for a second. In any other court in America, if a judge's spouse was texting one of the parties in a lawsuit, urging them to fight, that judge would be forced to recuse himself immediately. It is basic ethics. You cannot be the judge in a case where your wife is a player. But the Supreme Court has no binding code of ethics. They police themselves. And as Mayer's reporting highlights, Clarence Thomas decided that he didn't need to recuse himself. In fact, he did the opposite. When the case involving the Trump White House records that we now know contained those very texts from his wife, came before the Supreme Court. The court ruled 8-1 to release the documents to the January 6th committee. 8 justices said yes. 1 justice said no. That lone dissenter was Clarence Thomas. He voted to block the release of evidence that could potentially implicate his own wife in a plot to overturn the government. Meyer's analysis forces us to ask the uncomfortable question: was he voting on the law, or was he voting to protect his family? This is where the Meyer file goes deeper than just the headlines. Jane Meyer has spent her career tracking dark money, the hidden flow of cash from billionaires to political operatives. She applied this lens to the Thomas household, and what she found was disturbing. It wasn't just about ideology. It was about income. Meyer reported on how Ginni Thomas ran a consultancy firm called Liberty Consulting. On her website, she claimed she could leverage her experience and connections to help clients. But who were these clients? Meyer uncovered that one of them was the Center for Security Policy, a hardline right-wing think tank run by Frank Gaffney. At the very same time that Ginni Thomas was taking payments from this group, payments totaling tens of thousands of dollars, that group had business before the Supreme Court. They had filed an amicus brief, a legal document trying to tell the court how to vote in the Trump travel ban case. So you have a situation where a group pays the wife and then tells the husband how to rule. And did Clarence Thomas disclose this? No. For years, he checked a box on his financial disclosure forms saying his wife had no income, a claim that was so demonstrably false he later had to amend decades of forms, calling it a misunderstanding. Meyer's reporting suggests this isn't an accident. It is a feature of the system they built. She quotes ethical experts who are baffled by the brazenness of it. In her article, she details how Ginni Thomas gave an award to leaders of the movement at a fancy luncheon, while her husband, the justice, sat in the front row, beaming, described by attendees as a happy warrior. They operate as a team. Ginni rallies the troops, raises the money, and organizes the movement. Clarence writes the opinions that enshrine that movement's goals into law. Meyer points out that this destroys the very concept of judicial independence. If a judge attends a political rally, he is compromised. But if he sits in the front row while his wife leads the rally, is he somehow immune? The Thomas defense has always been that they live in separate lanes. Ginni has her lane, Clarence has his. But Meyer's investigation shows that those lanes have merged into a superhighway of influence. Let's look at the Stop the Steal connection again. Meyer reported that Ginni Thomas didn't just text Mark Meadows. She also emailed lawmakers in Arizona. She pressured state representatives to set aside the popular vote and appoint their own slate of electors to keep Trump in power. This is the definition of sedition: trying to overthrow a lawful election. And while she was doing this, cases related to the Arizona election were making their way through the federal court system, headed straight for the Supreme Court. If the plan had worked, if those Arizona legislators had done what Ginni Thomas asked, that case would have landed on Clarence Thomas's desk. And based on his history, based on his refusal to recuse, and based on his lone dissent in the January 6th case, we have every reason to believe he would have ruled in her favor. Jane Meyer's work illuminates this terrifying reality. We came dangerously close to a constitutional crisis where a Supreme Court justice would have been the deciding vote in a coup engineered, in part, by his own wife. Meyer also connects the dots to the broader dark money network she wrote about in her best-selling book. She explains that the Thomases are not operating in a vacuum. They are the crown jewels of a decades-long project by conservative billionaires to capture the American judiciary. We are talking about the Koch network, the Federalist Society, and donors like Harlan Crow. Now, while recent reports have focused on the luxury yachts and the private jet travel provided by Harlan Crow, Jane Meyer has been warning about the ideological capture for years. She explains that when billionaires fund Ginni Thomas's groups, They aren't just buying activism. They are buying access. They are buying a way to put money into the Thomas household without handing a bag of cash directly to the justice. It is a laundering operation for influence. You pay the consultant is the wife, and the wife sleeps next to the magistrate. Mayer quotes former ethics lawyers who call this the most significant breach of standards in the history of the court. But it gets worse. Mayer delves into the psychology of the couple. In her 1994 book, Strange Justice, she and Jill Abramson chronicled Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings and the Anita Hill testimony. She established a pattern back then, a willingness to bend the truth, a deep resentment of the liberal establishment, and a feeling of persecution. Fast forward 30 years, and Mayer finds that those resentments have calcified into a war against the modern American state. Ginni Thomas's rhetoric, calling the left tyranny, speaking of spiritual warfare, matches the tone of Clarence Thomas's most angry dissents. They feed off each other. Mayer describes a bunker mentality, where the Thomases believe they are the last line of defense against a socialist takeover. This belief system justifies everything. It justifies the lack of recusal, it justifies the secret payments, and it justifies the texts to overturn an election. In their minds, they aren't breaking the rules, they are saving the country. And that is what makes them so dangerous. A judge who believes he is on a holy mission is no longer a judge. He is a crusader. One of the most chilling details in Mayer's reporting is the silence of the other justices. She notes that the Supreme Court is a small, collegial club. They don't criticize each other in public. They don't enforce rules on each other. When Chief Justice John Roberts was asked to implement a code of ethics, he essentially said, "Trust us." Mayer argues that this trust has been weaponized. Clarence Thomas has exploited the politeness of the institution. He knows his colleagues won't call him out. He knows Congress is too gridlocked to impeach him. He knows that as long as he has a lifetime appointment, he is untouchable. And Ginni Thomas knows it too. That is why she operates with such impunity. She knows that no matter how radical her actions, no matter how close she gets to the line of insurrection, her husband's robe is a shield that protects them both. Mayer's reporting also highlights the specific organizations Ginni has led, like Groundswell and CNP Action. These aren't debating societies. These are action groups designed to purge disloyal Republicans and push the most extreme agenda possible. Mayer found that these groups were discussing strategies to pack the administration with Trump loyalists and to challenge the 2020 election months before a single vote was cast. Ginni Thomas was in the room where it happened, and Clarence Thomas was likely hearing about it over dinner. The idea that they don't discuss their work, the separate lanes defense, is laughable to anyone who reads Mayer's detailed accounts of their partnership. They call each other best friends. They do everything together. Are we really supposed to believe that the woman who was texting the chief of staff to save the Republic didn't mention it to her husband, the man who has the power to legally save the Republic? Mayer's reporting dismantles that defense with a sledgehammer of common sense. Let's talk about the impact of this. When a Supreme Court justice refuses to recuse himself from a case involving his wife's political activities, he is sending a message to the entire country. He is saying that the rules don't apply to him. He is saying that the court is not a neutral arbiter, but a political spoil. Mayer argues that this erodes the rule of law at its foundation. If the public stops believing that the court is fair, if they start seeing it as just another rigged political body, then the authority of the court evaporates. And that is exactly what is happening. Trust in the Supreme Court is at an all-time low, and Jane Mayer's reporting on the Thomas couple is a huge reason why. She pulled back the curtain and showed us the machinery. She showed us that the decisions affecting our lives, decisions on abortion, on voting rights, on environmental protection, are being made by people who are deeply entangled with the billionaires and activists who want those decisions to go a certain way. In her analysis of the Liberty Central launch, a Tea Party group Ginni started, Mayer found that the initial funding came from donors whose identities were hidden. But later, it was revealed that huge sums came from the network of Harlan Crow and other conservative megadonors. This was happening while Clarence Thomas was sitting on the court, ruling on Citizens United, the case that opened the floodgates for dark money in politics. Think about that circular logic. Clarence Thomas votes to allow unlimited secret money into politics. That secret money then funds his wife's salary. His wife then uses that money to build a political movement that supports his legal agenda. It is a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of corruption, and until Jane Mayer and a few others started digging, it was completely hidden from the American public. The Mayer file on Clarence and Ginni Thomas is not closed. In fact, it is growing. Every month, new financial disclosures, or lack thereof, come to light. New connections between Ginni's activist groups and the cases on the court's docket are revealed. But the core truth remains what Jane Mayer identified years ago. We have a Supreme Court justice who is living a double life. In one life, he is a jurist bound by the Constitution. In the other, he is the silent partner in a political firm that is trying to dismantle the modern American state. The texts to Mark Meadows were the smoking gun, but the ammunition was stockpiled years ago, paid for by the dark money donors that Jane Mayer has spent her life exposing. So, what happens next? Mayer's reporting is a call to action for Congress and for the American people. She has laid out the evidence. We know about the texts. We know about the money. We know about the failure to recuse. The question is no longer, what did they do? The question is, what are we going to do about it? As Mayer warns, a democracy that cannot police its own high court is a democracy on borrowed time. Justice Thomas may have the robe, and Ginni Thomas may have the connections. But the facts, the hard, undeniable facts in the Mayer file, are now out in the open. And in the end, sunlight is the only disinfectant that can clean the rot at the heart of our judicial system. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the Mayer file. This story is complicated, it is infuriating, and it is vital. If you believe that the Supreme Court should be held to the same ethical standards as the rest of the government, make sure you share this video. The algorithm tries to bury long-form investigative content, but we are counting on you to keep the truth alive. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us next time as we open another file on the people who really run Washington. I'm your host, signing off.